Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. My name is Nick Benner. I'm a junior pastor here at Living Word Church of Worcester. I want to welcome you to another video in our How to Read the Bible series. In this video, we'll be tackling how to read the Bible in context. And context is vitally important as we start to read and learn and study the Bible. And it helps us even when we try to apply it to ourselves, what we read in each verse, and live it out. And so first, what is context? To figure this out, I Googled the dictionary definition, and here's what I found. The circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. So basically, it's what's going on around what somebody has said, done, or thought. And knowing this helps us to understand what somebody means instead of assuming what we think they mean. And it's especially important when we read the Bible. And so we'll take a look at how and why it's important. In Bible school, I was taught that context is king. When you're trying to understand and interpret the Bible, that you have to understand context or know how to figure out what's going on around the verses that we read. Without understanding, all kinds of misunderstandings, misapplications, and misuses can happen, and a lot of other negative things. And maybe it's something you've seen yourself, that when you've said something, somebody heard half of it and they took it to mean something else instead of what you meant, causes a whole negative situation. And that's exactly what can happen with the Bible. When we read a verse or a passage at face value, we think we know what it means and we kind of assume, and we take that and run with it, and it can be a big mess up on what it actually means, and we can be misusing it and misapplying it. So now that we understand what context is and why it's important in reading the Bible, my goal is to show you how to do so, show you how to look at a verse and start to study and learn about the context so that we can pull the correct meaning out and then also correctly apply it to our own lives. And I found that the best way to do this is through examples. So I've picked two examples, one from the New Testament and the Old Testament, and that's what we'll be taking a look at in this video. The first example we're going to take a look at today is from the New Testament. It's from the book of Philippians. It's chapter 4, verse 13. You may have heard this verse quite a bit or seen it used many times. And depending on the version that you're reading from, it can say something like this: I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And when we read that at face value, it sounds like we can take on anything that comes our way because we can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Whatever situation I'm about to face, whatever challenge, whatever thing I'm trying to succeed on or accomplish, I can do it all because of the strength that Christ gives me. And often we see it used in sports, going for interviews or different things. You hear it quoted or used a lot in those situations. And it sounds pretty awesome. It sounds like a little bit of a pump-up verse and encouragement as you're about to take on some type of challenge. But even with a verse like this that seems to make sense on its own, we still should look into the context to see if we're really understanding what's being said, because sometimes it is different. And so what do? How do we start to look into context? The first place to look is the surrounding verses. So we just read verse 13, and that was it. So you want to look at a few verses before, a few verses after. It might include reading the whole passage, maybe the chapter, or maybe even the whole book, just to gain an understanding of what you're reading. So for verse 13, I just looked a couple verses ahead, and it gives a whole new perspective to what's being said. So we'll start from verse 10 through 13. It says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord, that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. So what was the author talking about? He's saying that he was not in need. That's the first thing he says in verse 11, is that I don't need anything. And that he's learned to be content in whatever situation that he's in. And we see that he's lived through it all. He knows what it's like to be wanting stuff or to have a lot of stuff, to be doing really well and be doing really poor. But he's saying whatever situation I'm in, whatever circumstance, I can be content. I'm not desiring something else, but I can endure, I can make it. And in 13, we see he can do this because of the strength that Christ gives him. So just reading 2 or 3 extra verses gives us a whole new meaning to this one verse, verse 13. It's not about accomplishing things, winning or conquering things. It's about being able to endure, to be content no matter what you're going through. That's what the author is trying to say. And it's because of the strength that Christ gives that he can make it, that he can endure and do well. So when we interpret to mean overcoming things or taking on challenges and things like that, we're actually pulling it out of context because we're just taking it at face value, assuming we know what it's talking about or what it means. Because the context, we see that it's clearly addressing being in need and being able to be content in whatever situation or circumstance you're in. And we gather that just from reading a few extra verses. We didn't have to do any crazy studying to figure that out. But there are some additional steps that we can take to gain an even better understanding, a greater picture of what's going on around this verse and even this whole passage. We can look into the author of this letter, of this book in the Bible. We can look up who is it written to, because usually there's a really good relationship somewhere in there that helps you gain a lot more understanding. And then historically, what was going on at that time? What would have impacted the things that were said in this book by what was going on? And some of this can be found by looking a little earlier in the book. If you go to the first chapter, first verse of Philippians, you'll see it says that Paul and Timothy were writing to the Church of Philippi. So right there, we've got the author and we've got the audience. 2 things right there. But otherwise, we can go beyond just the verses and use some extra tools to help us find this information. And that's what I've got right here in front of me. And I just want to show you a few. I think some of them are kind of easier to get your hands on and will help you greatly if you're starting to look into context and really trying to learn the Bible and understand it. And the first one's a study Bible. It's like a Bible, it just has some extra stuff in it. It gives you some commentary as you're reading verses. And before you read the book, there's a little intro that shares a bunch of overview information about the book as a whole. That's where you can find the author, the audience, and sometimes that historical stuff that's going on around that would impact what was written. So it's a really great tool, really helpful in understanding and starting to read more and go deeper into the Bible. And then another step is a commentary. I have 2 sets right here. I've got the Barnes Notes and the Expositors. They're very similar to the study Bible. They just give you commentary on each verse as you're reading. And then it also gives you that same background information. It usually has more than a study Bible will. It goes a little more in depth sometimes. So I like to use these a lot when I'm preparing for any teaching or even just doing devotionals. If I run into something I don't understand, these are the first 2 things that I go to, study Bible or a commentary set. And then another one is a Strong's Concordance. This is a big book. I don't have it with me right now. That's basically a big dictionary with every word in the Bible in it. And it's split into 2 halves. Because the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, New Testament was in Greek. So you can look up any word that's used in the Bible and it'll show you what it meant in the Hebrew or the Greek. Because sometimes there's different meanings for different words. Like the word love has different meanings in the New Testament. It's not always just one version of love. And through the Strong's Concordance, you can find that. And it usually will give a greater meaning to whatever verse or passage you were reading where love was mentioned. So that one's really helpful. And then the last one is the Bible Dictionary. This book is pretty awesome. It gives you words you can look up, and it'll give you a brief overview of everything in the Bible from it. I used it when I was preparing for this teaching. In the later part, I'll show what I did. I just looked up one word, and it gave me the overview of what that word was meant for the whole Bible. And it was really awesome. And so through those books, you'll find more information about the author, the audience, and the historical stuff. So for example, the author we found was Paul from the Bible, and from the commentaries, you'll find that he was in prison at the time, which gives a whole new meaning to that verse 13 when he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, because we understand he was talking about being in not so great situations. He can make it because of the strength that Christ gives. So he's almost saying, I can make it through prison because of Christ who strengthens me. And it just gives you that further understanding and more depth to what he's been saying. And then the audience, we see it's the Church of Philippi, which is a church that was planted by Paul on his second missionary journey. So in this book, you'll see a lot of intimacy. There's a lot of loving language. There's very little correction or rebuke. And a lot of Paul's letters have that in it, but Philippians has very little of it. And we figure that out through commentaries, the study Bible, learning those type of things. And it helps us to just really understand more about it. And then historically, we see that Christians were persecuted. That's why Paul is in prison. He was out sharing the gospel, giving the good news, and he ended up in prison for it. Yet still, the church was growing, it was expanding, and really good things were happening. And so all of this info put together that we can find through these extra tools give us a greater and clearer picture so that we can fully understand everything that Paul was writing in this letter. And that's really the basics of how to read the Bible in context, along with some very helpful tools that can help you to do that. And there's one other method that I've learned and I find extremely helpful, and I'll share that in just a bit when we look at the Old Testament example. The method I mentioned comes from a book titled Journey into God's Word by J. Scott Duvall. This book is all about understanding and interpreting the Bible to gain its true meaning. It's a very good resource. It's one that I learned from while I was in college, and it really helped me to learn how to gather up information about context and pull the true meaning out of a passage or even just a verse. And to do this, he gives us some steps, some really awesome steps. He gives you a picture to follow along. It's a picture of a town with a river and a bridge over it and another town. And as the steps go, you're following along this map. And so for the first step, it's grasping the text in their town. So you see that first town. What we're trying to do here is find out what the text meant to the biblical audience, not to us today. We're excluding ourselves. What did it mean to the people who originally heard it or read it? And then once we can kind of figure that out, we take a look at this river, which this means we got to find the differences between their time and our time. What are the big differences that separate us in between? And once we have that, we can cross the bridge. It's called the principalizing bridge. It's a little weird of a word, but all we're trying to do is pull a principle from the passage that bridges it over to us today. And then step 4 only matters if you're looking at an Old Testament verse, because you got to cross into the New Testament. We got to make sure that that principle matches across all of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. And if it doesn't, we have to probably rework our principle or do some more context study. But if it does, awesome, we're moving on, and then we try to grasp the text in our town. So how does this verse apply to us today as Christians, and how do we live it out? So it's some really awesome, straightforward steps on how to read the Bible, how to gain understanding and interpret it. And so the one last example I want to go through is from the Old Testament. I'm going to kind of loosely follow these steps. And it's going to be kind of a crash course version because this topic is a pretty big one. And for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of do an overview of it and give hopefully a decent amount of information on it. And the passage is Leviticus 4:27 through 31. I'm reading from the NIV. It says, "If any member of the community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, when they realize their guilt and the sins they have committed becomes known, they must bring as their offering for the sin they committed a female goat without defect. They are to lay their hand on the head of the sin offering and slaughter it at the place of the burnt offering. Then the priest is to take some of the blood with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. They shall remove all the fat, just as the fat is removed from the fellowship offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar as an aroma, pleasing to the Lord. In this way the priest will make atonement for them, and they will be forgiven." So we see that this passage is about sin. And we see that if somebody sins, they have to make a sacrifice in order to be forgiven. And this sacrifice is a female goat without blemish or defect. And the priest has some specific instructions regarding the sacrifice on how to do it, with the blood, the fat, and all that fun stuff. And then the sacrifice is burned, and it will produce an aroma that smells sweet to the Lord, and this will make atonement for the one who sinned, and they will be forgiven. So that's ultimately kind of a quick summary of what's going on there, and there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of stuff here that might sound kind of weird, something we don't really see today. So there's a lot of studying that we can do to try and figure this out. Because right off the bat, you see if any member of the community sins, they have to make a sacrifice in order to be forgiven. And I'm not sure about you, but I know I'm a member of a community. I've sinned, but yet I have never done this. And I've never seen it in today's world or heard about it happening. It'd be kind of a little weird. But why not? It's in the Bible. It's in this book that we live by, that we obey and do everything it says. So how come we don't do that anymore? There's some kind of disconnect here that maybe we don't see. And matter of fact, a lot of stuff in Leviticus itself we don't follow anymore. There's a bunch of laws that we don't go along with. So we're going to walk through this example, and through this I want to show you what it's like to interpret an Old Testament passage and bring it around to today and how we can apply it today. So the first step is to gather up some context. First thing we want to do is find out what the text meant when it was written. Not about us or our understanding, but what it would have meant to the original audience. So we got to find who the author is, who the audience is, and the historical or cultural info, as much of it as we can. So obviously, as we stated, the passage is about sin and the sacrifice that is needed for forgiveness. And like we did with Philippians, we can look at some surrounding verses to maybe find some of that info. For this one, we'll go all the way to the beginning of chapter 4. It says in verse 1, "The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites." So right there, we can kind of knock out the audience. We've got God talking to Moses, who then relays the information to the Israelites. So that's who is hearing this. This is the audience, whoever this is being spoken to. So we've got Moses. He led the Israelites out of Egypt from the Exodus, and he would speak with God and then in turn relay the information to the Israelites. And that's what Leviticus is. It's Moses relaying laws from God to the people of Israel. And then the Israelites, they're God's chosen people. Or another term would be the Jewish people. That's who they were. So God is giving his chosen people laws and ordinances, things that they're supposed to do, commandments, and they're supposed to obey them. So that's what you can really gather from the book itself, from the passages close to it. For the rest of the info, we need to really look at these other tools to find some of this other information, which is what I did to prepare for this. I looked through these books a lot to try and find some of this information and make sense of it all. So for the author, through the commentaries, I found that it's Moses. Moses is credited with writing the first 5 books of the Bible, it's called the Pentateuch or the Torah. That's what he is said to have written. So Moses would be the author, which means this is first-hand account stuff that he saw and experienced. And then when, or what's going on in history at this time, this again from the commentary, it's after the Exodus from Egypt. Israel's starting to become its own nation, and God is giving laws for his people, his chosen people, to follow. And most of these rules have to do with their relationship with him, whether it's about worship, purification, the sacrifices, offerings, how to treat one another, all kinds of different things. That's what is going on at this time. And then their understanding of it. What would this have meant to them? What it would have sounded like? Different things like that. I found that through the Bible dictionary. I went and looked up the word sacrifice, and it showed me a whole overview of sacrificing in the Old Testament, the New Testament, what the prophets thought of it, principles in it, all this different awesome stuff. And so what I found is that sacrifices were normal for this time. We even see since Cain and Abel, there were sacrifices being made. Noah made a sacrifice, an offering after the flood. And then there's plenty more throughout even Genesis. And in Exodus, we see the first description of an organized sacrificial system. In Leviticus, what we just read, is the first and most detailed description of that system. And the purpose of it was to be the physical expression of their inward devotion. This was supposed to be worship, spending time with God and doing his commandments and being obedient to him, living how he wanted them to. And then most other cultures and religions were doing the same thing. They were offering up sacrifices and offerings to idols and other deities that they all worshipped. So this was something they would have known about. They would have related to it because they would have seen it and experienced it. But now it was being made into law, something that they had to obey, becoming organized. And they held to this law for a very long time because they were commanded to do so. So through this studying, we've got a pretty good grasp of what was being said to the Israelites and what they would have understood about it. So then we can go to step 2 with the differences, measuring that width of the river. Now we have to think about the differences between then and now, because it starts to help us get it to today. It's really important with Old Testament passages especially. One of the biggest biblical differences, which can help clear up a lot of this information, which is a very, very deep and big topic, is we're under a different covenant. Now this is a huge deal because a covenant is an oath-bound promise. At the time, to the original audience, they were under the Mosaic covenant, which was basically God saying to the Israelites, if you obey my commandments, you'll be my chosen people. There'll be blessings, all this good stuff. But it was dependent on their obedience. And they said, yep, we'll do it. So that's the covenant they were under. But we have the new covenant that's brought about by Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. And we see that in Luke 22:20. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. And Jesus even fulfilled the law of Moses, the stuff that we were just reading about in Matthew 5:17. It says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. The Bible shows us that nobody was able to follow under this Mosaic covenant. There was always mess-ups, that obedience was difficult, that there were different things people did, and it never really resulted in anything good. But Jesus comes in and he does. He follows it to a T, and his death and blood brings in the new covenant because he is that perfect lamb that without blemish. He's able to be the last, final, and all-sufficient sacrifice for sin. So there's no more need to sacrifice animals anymore. Now by faith, we ask to receive what he did for us on the cross and then ask for forgiveness of sins and receive it. And now the Holy Spirit dwells within us and we follow after him. And as seen, this is a huge topic. There's way more study that can go into this to gain more understanding. I'm trying to do an overview. It's hard not to go really deep with it. So it's definitely worth looking into more. But for time's sake, I'm trying to get through it with an overview. So you've still got some other differences. Odds are we're not Israelites. We would be considered Gentiles. Gentile is anyone who was not Jewish. So odds are we're not the literal lineage of the Israelites, God's chosen people, but we're the Gentiles. And this ties into the new covenant because salvation was offered to everybody, not just people who are literal descendants of the Israelite people. So it's another thing that just ties into that new covenant. So there's a lot there to really dive into. And then there's some obvious stuff like history. We're living post-Jesus, and there's tech, there's culture, there's language, all these different things that are different. But we've got our next step is to pull a principle from the passage, which is just going to be a short summary or statement of what the passage was saying to the audience. So here we have to consider both the context we found as well as the differences when figuring this all out. So we're looking to find the meaning in it, not create our own meaning or pull our own. We're trying to see what it meant to the original people, create a principle that can even stretch into the New Testament, the whole Bible. And the next step will help us make sure. So it could be something along the lines of forgiveness of sin is brought about by a sacrifice, and the sacrifices of the law were a foreshadowing of the ultimate and final sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So it's just a short statement, a little 2 sentences, whatever that is. It doesn't have to be anything too crazy, but it's just a little statement, a little principle that we can start to try and pull into the New Testament, which is the next step. We got to make sure that it meshes, that it makes sense across the board. So does this fit into the New Testament? If it doesn't, there's an issue. We have to maybe go back, rework the principle, do more studying. And as you study, you'll probably find this information already, whether or not this principle is going to tie in, because most commentaries or even the study Bibles will start to make those connections already. So sometimes this is easy breezy. And so I found a passage in Hebrews that I felt just really nailed this whole topic, made sure that it meshes together. So we got Hebrews 10, 1 through 10. It says, the law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. Otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshippers would have been cleansed once for all, and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. With burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased. Then I said, Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, my God." First he said, "Sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, though they were offered in accordance with the law." Then he said, "Here I am. I have come to do your will." He set aside the first to establish the second, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So Paul is essentially saying the old sacrifices did not really cut it. They could not fully cleanse us from sin. But Jesus' sacrifice does. And that's how we are made holy and just, by his blood and his perfect sacrifice. And we can pull plenty of other verses to support this, but this one really shows that that principle does mesh with the New Testament. But we've got one final step left. So how do we apply this today as Christians? So simply in Leviticus, we see that sacrifice and forgiveness go hand in hand, and we see that it has throughout the Bible. But God's plan was always to reconcile his people to himself through Jesus and his ultimate sacrifice. Leviticus and all the sacrifices point us towards Jesus, who would be the final sacrifice. So now we can go straight to God when we sin and ask forgiveness. So as you can see all the way through this process, all we're trying to do is understand context and pull the meaning out of it, and just make sure that it makes sense across the board. We're not trying to create a new meaning or put our own meaning into it. But I found that this method is super helpful, straightforward, an easy way to determine and examine verses and passages and find the true meaning, and also bring it around to today. So those are the basics of how to read the Bible in context. Sometimes it can be as simple as reading a few extra verses. Maybe it's the whole passage, the whole book. Maybe it's a lot of extra studying in other tools that we've got going on. And to be honest, I had to do a lot of studying to really look at Leviticus and pull all that information out. It was through these books right here. And sometimes it can be like that. But in the end, it's always, always, always worth it, because you gain a better understanding of Scripture. You're able to communicate it to other people who ask, and it's overall just a great time to learn the truth in God's Word. So I hope that through this teaching, you have a better understanding of what context is, how to look for it and find it in the Bible, through the Bible, and with some extra tools, and hopefully you feel more comfortable doing so. So I want to say thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of this series on how to read the Bible, and God bless.